So this is the webinar, 3 ways to incorporate coding into your special education classes. So we're going, and we have our lovely guest, Ashley Fort here, which she'll introduce herself in a few minutes. But to get started, we wanted to start with some polls just to see what our audience is like and to get a feel for who we're talking to today. So we're gonna launch our first poll. Awesome. So you should see it on your screen now. So it's just, what is your role? What do you do? I'd love to hear.
I know the title of the webinar is Incorporating Coding into Special Education, but I saw on the registration list, not everybody has a special education title. So I'm very excited to see who is actually able to join us live.
Yeah, sweet. So we have some tech teachers. Sweet. And a few special ed teachers. A lot of others. I'm curious to see what the others are.
Yeah, anybody who put other, please write us in the chat and let us know what your role is.
Yeah. Oh, and then the second question too is, what type of learning are you currently participating in? Are you virtual, hybrid, or in person? It seems like a lot of virtual too.
Yeah, a lot of virtual.
Cool. I'll give you a few more minutes to vote if you haven't, and then we can share the results. So you can all see it.
And for those who entered the webinar after we launched the poll, you might not see it, but let us know in the chat what your role is and if you're virtual, hybrid, or in person right now. We got lots of people, tech integration, librarian, amazing. Love working with librarians or library media specialists. Got some instructional coaches from a Head Start program, that's fantastic. An education consultant and paraprofessional. Wonderful. Okay.
Let's see, I'll end it and then share the results so you guys can all see. It's very great.
So we got a pretty diverse crowd here, but mostly tech teachers and special integration teachers. Wonderful. Awesome. And actually the majority is other, so.
And it's mostly virtual learning right now, which makes sense, but we have some in person, so that's great. Awesome, so I think we can get started to the next slide, if you're ready.
Yes.
With some more introductions, so Lauren, you can start.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. For those who have never come to a webinar with me before, my name is Lauren. I'm from the Unruly team. For those of you who are joining us for the second, third, or umpteenth time, welcome back. I'm excited to have you here. Ashley is one of our special guests for today. I'll let her introduce herself next, but super excited to be here today and talk about coding for special education.
Yeah, and my name's Marissa. I'm also from Unruly. I'm newer to the team, so you might not have seen me at a webinar before if you've come to these before, but I work mostly with social and content marketing with the team, and I'm happy that you guys are all here, and I'm happy to be here.
And we got Ashley, so she's our special guest for today. Ashley, want to tell everybody about yourself?
Sure. I am a digital learning coach, and like I said earlier, I'm from South Carolina. I teach in a small rural district, and I serve all 4 schools in our district, and I'm just really excited to be here. I love working with students and teachers. Integrating technology and coding is a passion of mine. So real excited to share with y'all today how I'm using coding with our special ed students. So shall I get started?
Yes, please do.
Awesome. So I want to start with the why, because I think that's important to always, whatever we're doing in education, we need to know what our why is. And this John Dewey quote really sums it up. We want to give our students something to do and not just something to learn, because it's in the doing that the learning results. And we want to get students thinking about what they're doing. And so I think this quote really kind of sums up the whole why. But there are a few more things as well. So Right here, this is the profile of the South Carolina graduate. This is kind of our why in South Carolina, and your state might have something similar. I also think of it like a national framework would be that the framework of 21st century learning. You might be familiar with that, but these skills, the world-class skills of creativity, innovation, critical thinking and problem solving and communication, information technology and media are all so important skills for our students to develop. And then also that the life characteristics of perseverance, I think really comes through with coding activities as well. These are really important to develop because, as you can see here from the Future of Jobs report by the World Economic Forum, they predict that these will be the top 10 skills of 2025. And if you look on that, a lot of those were reflected in that the profile of the graduate that I just shared with you, and also in that 21st century learning framework. But that analytical thinking, complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, and technology use, of course, is important, and even the design and programming. Not every student is going to be a computer programmer, but the skills that they learn through actively coding will result in a lot of these. They can develop a lot of these things that employers will be looking for.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought this up, Ashley, because I think the impression sometimes is that, if students aren't going to go into programming, for a career path, and they don't need to learn it. But you're absolutely right. I think it ties into all of these critical thinking skills that they're going to need, no matter what career path or that they choose in the future.
Right. And another great thing about coding is that it really creates a culture of perseverance or resilience, if you will, and even risk taking, or we like to call it failing forward. And, we try to encourage our kids when they make mistakes to learn from those mistakes. A mistake is not the end, it's the beginning of the learning. And so it's really important too that the adults in their children's lives model those traits as well. So when I'm around students and I mess up, I make a huge deal about that and talk about, okay, how can I overcome this? So teachers and parents need to model that for students. And then of course, in your culture, to really have a great coding program, you're going to have to value student voice and choice. You want to get them, give them a voice in what they're doing and allow them to make choices, because like that quote there at the bottom, Davis says, we've got to stop doing everything for kids. If we are, it says step aside and let them do the tricky stuff, the fun stuff, the hard stuff, the menial stuff. My philosophy is anything you can put back on the students, do that. And in just a moment, we're going to move into the why, of using coding with special education students. But I want to point out something in this quote, is because there is a teacher that I've worked with before, and I really had to coach her to allow her kids to do things. She was afraid they couldn't do it when it came to technology. And I had to coach her to step back and just to see what they were capable of doing and assure her, you can tell them you're here to support them, but you're going to give them the chance to do some of the hard stuff and the tricky stuff, and they'll grow from it.
Absolutely. We're all about failing forward here at Unruly too. And this applies, to clarify, would you say this applies for all students?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Great. All right. So tell us sort of, why do you think it's important to have coding as a part of, special education classes and modifying it for special education classes?
Okay. So if you'll go on to the next slide, I think this really sums it up, this first piece. If it's good for regular education class, it's good for the special education class. I'm sure we can all agree with that. You just need to modify and differentiate your process and materials. So, we want in our district, especially, we try to be as inclusive as possible and give all of our students the same opportunities. And so that's one of the reasons I think it's important. And, you know, and not just your mainstream kids, but the kids that might be self-contained as well, to allow them to have opportunities. And I've pushed into a lot of those classes and enjoyed working with them. It's really important to get your special education students engaged. Sometimes when they are struggling with academic content, they love using technology because some of them will find their strengths in that, and they want to learn how to make technology do useful things. Right before we got out for break, we were doing an hour of code, and I pushed into a special education class, and we were using Splats, and one of the fellas was able to code his splat to make a quack sound. And he got so tickled because one of the paraprofessionals has a ringtone that was a quack sound. And he was just so excited that he made that splat do what that phone did. So it gives them that, you know, it really encourages them that they can code technology just like the person who made the iPhone make the quack sound. So we really enjoyed seeing the excitement on his face and in his voice that he was the one that created that. And like I mentioned before, they're not coding to learn computer science. We're giving these children the opportunity to learn more problem-solving skills and perseverance, critical thinking, creativity, and innovation. And it also promotes these skills in the cognitive domains. The link there at the bottom, when we share the presentation, you'll be able to see the research behind this, but it improves attention, language, working memory, and somatic memory retrieval.
What is somatic memory retrieval? That sounds so interesting.
I tried to get into the research a little bit, but you know, I guess it does. Instead of that working memory probably being more of what, you know, what you're working with right now, things that you've stored away.
That deeper learning.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So instead of memorizing it, just really like, yeah, understanding it.
So so now that we've talked about the why, let's talk about the how, because this is the piece that's going to help you actually put this into practice. And before I get into the step-by-step, I do want to give you a little bit of background about my district. So if you're thinking, my district's like this, how are we going to do that? Hopefully some of you may find some commonalities with us. We are a small rural district. There are 4 schools, primary, elementary, middle, and high. And we are one-to-one Chromebooks from kindergarten to 12th grade. Our K-4 students have iPads. We are a Google reference district in our 5th year of using Google with students. And so as a Google reference district, Google looks at your usage and how teachers and students are implementing the products in the classroom. And we were invited to be a reference district, and that was so important. So we were able to share the great things that we were doing with other districts. And in the past, we've had other districts come and actually check out our coding program. And so if you'll go on to the next slide, Lauren, this is kind of where it starts. Oh, that was our school website.
It's on the link.
That was linked right there.
There we go.
Okay, so this is where we started as a district. And even if your district's not exactly like ours and you don't have the human resources that we do, you can still hopefully find some common ground and maybe follow some of these steps. So we are really lucky to have some amazing media specialists in our district, and they start laying that coding foundation really early. And students would go to the media center weekly or bi-weekly and learning a lot about the underlying concepts of coding, and also developing a capacity for navigating platforms. You know, anytime students are learning a new tech thing, that's one of the things that they like to help mitigate for teachers, so teachers aren't having to teach the kids how to do this and how to do that, because teachers are concerned about their content. So that's where the media specialists and then the folks in my position, the tech coaches, can come in and work alongside teachers to help make connections between those really engaging coding activities and the content standards. And what we found is sometimes we would just develop the lessons for them and say, hey, I'll come in and teach this and you can just sit back and watch. And that gave them enough confidence maybe to try it out the next time. And sometimes the teacher would be like, will you just come in here with me and co-teach it? And then eventually they would gain buy-in or even confidence to do it on their own. And so we're really fortunate that we have kits available for checkout. So not every single teacher had to go out and buy a whole bunch of coding stuff. Some of them, the media specialists, used their funds. We were able to write grants in some cases to get some things. We had technology funds we were able to purchase things with. So we've got kits to check out human coding, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and some robots, Ozobots and Cubeto. And that last little item on the screen, when you get your hands on the presentation, you can click on that and there's a whole Google sheet full of resources connecting to some of the activities that we've done in our district.
Awesome. I love that. So many resources. And I think a lot of the commonalities that we see as well working with teachers is that many of them don't have coding experience, and that's totally okay.
Right.
I first learned, block coding with Splats. So it's actually a really fun way to learn new things yourself too. And it's okay to learn with your students. So
exactly.
Awesome.
And so just a little bit more on that, building that foundation, is you got to expand the buy-in to your other colleagues, but also to the students. And so a lot of these examples were pre-COVID era, and unfortunately right now kids aren't visiting our coding stations in our Learning Commons. But when they open back up, and I'm hoping they will eventually, we'll have, we've in the past had different stations with Scratch Junior and Osmo coding apps, Ozobots, Dash and Dot are another robot examples with block coding with an iPad, and Cubeto. And I'm going to touch on some of these in just a minute, but another awesome thing that we were able to do in our district is partnerships between our schools allowed students to travel and teach each other. So in the past, we were able to let our middle school kids go to the elementary school. The campuses are within walking distance. And then in another year, the elementary school kids came over to the middle school and they would teach each other. And in some case, the elementary students were the more knowledgeable ones about a certain platform or robot, and they taught the middle school kids. So it was a lot of fun getting those different groups and ages of students together. And we were able to do it with the primary and elementary schools, the primary and high school as well, because they're closely located. And our high school kids would drive over there. And just because the past couple of years, the high school kids that were in the upperclassmen actually didn't get the coding foundation that kids are getting now, just because it's really exploded in the past 5 years or so. And they just they weren't young enough to get it when they were at the primary or elementary school. And so you can see in the far right picture, those younger kids were actually teaching the older kids what they knew. And so it was real exciting, a way for your younger students to show off what they know and demonstrate what they know, and then getting the high school kids exposed to something that they may have missed when they, because it wasn't around when they were younger. And then also our hour of code activities. Again, we tried to involve all of our students, and you can see in the bottom two left-hand pictures, we invited our special ed kids to lead some of these activities because they had done it in their classroom, and they were able to show some of the other kids that weren't as experienced with coding how the different games worked. And so we had a great time, and they really enjoyed it too.
I love that. The younger students teaching the older students and just like the co-learning, because I certainly didn't learn any of this when I was in elementary school. And now we're seeing kindergartners, coding their own games, which is amazing.
It is. So here, now that we've kind of talked about building that foundation and getting buy-in, this is really the, I kind of call this a progression from moving from the concrete to the abstract. And we like to start for our, least experienced coders with what we call human coding. And I'm going to delve into that in just a minute. But really, it's what it sounds like, where they're actually moving on a grid and somebody's telling them what to do in a sequence. The paper-based sequence coding is very similar. It might be as simple as, writing out the steps of something, or having blocks from a certain coding program, or just different arrows and movements printed out on paper and cut out so kids can move them around like manipulatives. The bridge activities that we're going to talk about are where you would kind of move to next. And we like to do this because, again, it reinforces some of the movements that they're learning and still involves some manipulatives, but also in each of these cases with Cubeto and Ozobots that I'm going to talk about in a minute, brings in a robot. So it's kind of integrating what they're doing with the concrete things and bringing in a piece of technology. So it's a good segue to that end product, or the end process with the plugged coding. And we've had great success with Scratch Junior and Scratch. Splats, of course, and code.org has lots of great coding lessons for students, and CS First. And I'm going to touch on some of those in just a minute.
Awesome. And if anybody has used any of these technologies before, or you're using a different coding technology, feel free to write us in the chat too and let us know what you guys are doing to incorporate coding into some of your classes or at your school if you're a digital coach.
Yeah, that leads us into the next poll to get some temperature check on exactly what Lauren just said. So you can check off all the different ones you did that Ashley mentioned so we can see what you guys have been doing. Yeah, or type in the chat if it's not on the list too. That works.
Awesome. And if you're brand new to coding, that's also totally okay. Let us know in the chat too. We love working with people who are brand new to coding.
Yeah. Awesome. We're getting a lot of variety, which is great.
Lots of code.org, which is amazing. I would love to hear how many of you were doing a hour of code, which just passed recently. So much fun.
Awesome.
Nice. I'll give you guys about 10 more seconds.
Paper-based activities too. That's great.
Yeah, a lot of paper-based activities, which is fantastic.
Awesome. Okay. Give you one more second and then I'll end it and then I'll share it with everyone. Great. Thanks for sharing, guys.
It's like code.org was the winner, very closely followed by Scratch and paper-based coding and sequencing, which is amazing.
That's awesome.
All right, so let's talk Unplugged.
Okay, great. So it seems like some of you are familiar with the human coding, and what we did was we made a grid. On the far left, you can see it's on the back of the library rug, but on the other pictures, we just actually put tape on a shower curtain. So we started calling it shower curtain coding, and kids actually just put out blocks. One student would be the programmer, and then another student might move their self or an object around on the grid. So we had our pre-K students over there on the left. You can see they're doing some story sequencing, and the teacher's moving it right now. I think I went in their classroom one time and they might have been moving on the grid, but they used it to retell a story. And they would put the pictures from different events in the story, and then somebody would lay out the code. And we just left it with really simple blocks: forward, turn left, turn right. And so to really start teaching kids how explicit coding is, and that every, like when they're watching something on the screen, every tiny little movement that little character makes has to be coded. And so you can't, there's not of movement for turn around and jump. You have to do every little movement. And so they would lay out the blocks and make that happen. On the other side, the coding Mr. Potato Head, that's just a fun introductory lesson. But we also always want to take our coding activities back to the content that the students are learning. And so in the bottom right, we were actually coding vocabulary from the unit they were doing, Exploring the New World. So they had lots of vocabulary about, early American history, and they would have to code their classmates to a picture. And then that when they got there, they had to explain what the picture represented.
I like that. Coding Mr. Potato Head sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, but his different parts are on the grid, and so they're trying to put him back together.
That's awesome. And these are all linked too. So when I send out the slide deck, you'll be able to take a look at some of Ashley's presentations, because there's a lot of examples that there's not enough time in an hour to go through. So
our first bridge activity is Cubetto, and I really love this activity because, again, it connects back to that grid that kids were using, but and then also the manipulatives. So you can see on the picture on the right, these boys, they have the board, and they're actually building their code with little blocks that fit in there. And then when they built it, they press the button, and the little wooden robot moves along the map. And I love this because each of the kits comes with a story. And so you can read the story and program the robot through that story, or you can have kids create their own stories. So you can bring writing into this. There's a couple of different maps. There's a space one, and there's a map of Egypt. And I use this not with a special ed class, but with some older kids, and we learned about Egypt and Egyptian history using that. So even though this is marketed for younger kids, it's just a great tool for introducing early coders or students that have never done any kind of coding. This is a great place to start. It actually was, I think, created for Montessori classes, and our Montessori teachers had it in their classes, and then the media specialist found out about it, and she bought one, and then the other digital learning coach bought one for us, and we just have really enjoyed using it. Even older students get tickled about the little sounds he makes, and it's just a lot of fun and a great way to get those early, those foundational coding concepts down.
absolutely. And I love that you're talking about cross-curricular coding as well, because I do feel like some teachers can get overwhelmed thinking they need to do a whole unit on coding, or it needs to be this separate thing. But when you're incorporating it into other subjects, it kind of takes some of that pressure off too.
Right, exactly. And another little robot that I love is the Ozobot. And again, this one is really student friendly. They are color-based codes, so students can use markers, or you can get the stickers that go with the Ozobots. This was actually, besides Scratch Junior that I'll talk about in just a minute, Ozobots were one of the first ones I used when I was still in the classroom. And students just really enjoy using the codes to make the Ozobot do different things. Since it's come out, there is also a block-based coding option on devices, but I do prefer the screen-free option still. And I love that Ozobots really empower students, because what I will have them do, like in the friction investigation over there, for instance, they had to think about the different scenarios that were offered. And actually, Lauren, will you go to the next slide, because I inserted the activity. So I apologize, my cursor's in that picture, but at the top, but you can kind of get the gist. They were studying friction. And so they were imagining that the Ozobot was a ball. And so what would you do if you just rolled it easily down the hall? And they would choose a code and they have to justify why they chose that code. So the next one, if you kicked it hard, and ideally kids would use a code that would speed the Ozobot up, and then they would be able to explain, well, I chose, the lightning code because he's going to go really fast. And then, there were scenarios, if you rolled the ball through the grass, and then they would slow him down because it would, there's more friction. So what it does is it gets kids coding and gets them excited about learning and excited about the content. And then that you have them use their content vocabulary and accessing their knowledge about what they learned about the content. And so it's really exciting having them demonstrate and talk about what they know. And then finally, our plugged in options. The block-based coding on Chromebooks or iPads with Scratch Junior. If you're moving into device coding, that's a great place to start because it's very simple. The blocks lock together real simply. And again, this is one that I used in my classroom, one of the first examples. And it helps to prepare students who are ready for more complex coding, block coding in Scratch. And the student there in the picture with the iPad, we did an introductory block-based coding lesson, and that's attached there. But we really enjoyed it. You can do it on iPads or on Chromebooks as well. And I love telling stories with Scratch Junior because they can create different pages and animate them. And I can't remember exactly what kind of stories we did with this one, but in the past, other ways I've used it is for kids used it to tell fables. So we really had a great time telling stories, illustrating our stories with Scratch Junior. And then the other example is CS First. And the reason I want to share that one is because, like Lauren said before, teachers, you don't have to know a lot about coding. Especially, if you've got some great resources in your building that can help you. But curriculums like CS First are great because they have videos built in, and it will actually tell the students what to do. So you just assign that lesson to them, and they can go in and it talks them through everything they need to do. In that example, students were creating a Google logo. So that was a great introductory lesson because all the kids knew what the Google logo was, and then they were able to modify it and make changes to it and have a lot of fun with block-based coding.
That looks like a lot of fun. And modification of existing code is also another great way to introduce, and not overwhelm students who maybe have never worked with code before, and learning how it works.
And so that brings us to Splats. So in just a moment, I'm going to share with you some ways I've used Splats with our students. And I just found out about Splats last year, but I got real excited because it takes the screen-based coding and then it connects to these devices, kind of like the robots, but it gets kids moving around. So they're creating their games and they're participating in the games together. And it's just so much fun because it really is different than any other coding product that's out there because they can be involved and you can step on them. That is one of the coolest things that I thought. They're very durable and sturdy, and you can create so many different types of games. The students can, and then they actually can turn around and play those games.
Absolutely. And they are built to be stomped on, we say. And we've gone into classrooms sometimes where the students will be like, are you sure? And we're like, yes, really, you can stomp on them. And so at first they're kind of timid to do it, but then they really get excited when they can jump on it. All right. So
I'm sorry. Did you want to?
No, please. I was just going to introduce and
ask you about the voting machine game that you've played with your students.
Okay, so if you're not familiar with Splats, when you get in there, it's like the coding piece is a lot like the other block-based coding. Some of the blocks are a little bit different, but as I looked at the different activities, I found that the voting machine was one of the ones what I think is a great place to start because it's not too complex, but it has enough pieces and steps to it to challenge students. So if we're thinking about that progression I talked about before, we kind of wanted to break that down and show you how you could use Splats with the unplugged, bridged, and plugged in progression. So first of all, for unplugged, you could have screenshots of the blocks and print them out, cut them out, and have kids manipulate them and build a code. And that's a great way to introduce it and get kids to thinking about the steps in the process. And also even, putting things together. Then you could move over to the bridge part, have that teacher build what the kids have built, and then test it out, debug it. A great activity with coding is for the teacher to build it or have the kids build something and then go back and modify it and debug it or figure out what's wrong. And so again, that bridge place, you could have students play a Splats, and I apologize for the spelling error, a Splats game with a teacher created or peer created code. And this is how I kind of introduced Splats to my students. I showed them the code, I showed them the Splats. This is what I did, and then I let them go and play it. And the important thing right at this moment, though, would be to have kids look back at the code, think about what the Splats are doing, what they are doing, and how it relates. So they need to start making those connections. And that's why this is a bridge. You're bridging from the concrete to the abstract. They see what the Splats are doing, but looking back at the code to figure out what's causing it to happen. And then finally, the plugged in option is having students create their own. And we've had lots of fun and lots of success with all our students, but with our special ed students as well, building their codes in Splat and being able to play their games and show what they've learned. And the voting machine slide deck is linked there. And I'm going to show you a slide deck in just a moment. I think, Lauren, is it on the next page?
I think so. I was going to say bonus points to anybody who can find the bug in the code on the third photo from the left side, because I put that there purposefully, but as an example. But yeah, I think I love debugging. I think it's a great way to introduce kind of students to some of the fun ways. It's almost like a puzzle. And then also limiting the number of blocks that they use, which you mentioned in the first one, where you're like, okay, let's try some different ways to plug these together and see what happens.
Right.
So I'll go to the next slide. Is this the one that you're looking for?
Yes. So last year, when I found out about Splats, I actually was able to do a Splats pilot. And I worked specifically with the kids in this photograph. I think I got almost all of them in these photographs. This is a self-contained class at our high school, and they had PE as one of their classes each day, and I partnered with the PE teacher, and she's in the top right photo there, and we had the best time in working with coding and Splats, and we were having a ball. And of course, COVID happened and ruined all our fun. But these are some of the activities that we were able to do besides the voting machine. We did 4 Splats, which I'm going to show you in just a minute, and also the red splat, green splat. So 4 Splats is kind of like the 4 corners game, where you would send kids would go to the corners in the room and somebody would stand in the middle with their eyes closed, point to a corner, whoever's in that corner has to sit down. Similarly, there would be 4 Splats, and kids would go and they'd be lit up, and then if your Splats light went off, you had to go sit down. So and then red splat, green splat, that's self-explanatory too, like red light, green light. And we did that in the hall behind the gymnasium, and we had a blast. And it, each student had the opportunity to build their code. Well, I say that a couple of them did work together in partners and to support each other. The fella at the top left, he prefers to work solo, but he built his own code, and we ran every child's game. And so every student had an opportunity for their game to be played. And I'm going, or actually, Lauren, if you'll click on FOR Splats, and I can show them my lesson. Because I love to use the presentations to talk them through it and to keep me on track too, as well. Because sometimes when I just get in the platform, I might forget a step. But this is such a great way to, to scaffold the coding and the lesson for your students. So right away, I have the code set up and I let them play around. And that gets them real excited about the game. And then I tell them, they're going to do it. I like to activate prior knowledge as well. So on the next slide, I shared a code from the voting machine, because this was the lesson we did second. And so we talked about the differences that we saw and what blocks they recognized and what they didn't. So just enough to kind of activate what start block they noticed that they would be using, because in Splats there's two different start blocks. One is when you hit run, and the other is when you press the splat. So they had to know about that. And then on the next slide, we also looked to see how many splats we were going to actually be using. In voting machine, we only used 2, but in FOR Splats, we used 4. And so I tried again to pull as much as that they learned from the first lesson at the beginning. And then I introduced what they were going to be doing on the next slide, and showed them what the code was going to be, introduced the game. And so that was how we kind of started the class. The next slides, Lauren, are just telling them how to get signed in. So if you'll skip on down to right there, what's your code? I think it's slide 9.
Nice.
And I built the code for them, and then we talked about the different blocks. And I also included a little GIF. I love GIFs because it shows them they have to actually have 2 blocks and put them together. But they think it's cool as well, just because, they're used to seeing those, on their phones or on the computers. And so it just makes it a little fun. But I like to break this down for them. And of course, as they got more experienced, I was going to, give them less of a scaffold and let them kind of, give them a little bit more leeway to choose the wrong blocks. But then the rest of the lesson kind of talks them through everything. Will you go to slide 12, actually, because this is the important part. So I always gave that stuff to them ahead of time, and then I would give them the time to play. And I would watch them, not correct them, let them build their code the way they thought it was going to be, and then they would test it. And then if it was right, yay, they did it. But if it wasn't, they had the opportunity to debug it and figure out what was wrong. And that's where the real higher order thinking comes, and they have to kind of figure out, well, what did I do wrong? What do I need to do differently? And they really enjoy that part. And then after that, they connect and we play their games, and they enjoy that so much. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our slide decks are set up just like this. And just talking them step by step. Then we'll have there's our playtime. And then at the end, we debrief, because that's important to talk about what we learned, what went well, what didn't go well, so they can take some of that with them to the next lesson.
I love that. And definitely having the opportunity to play each other's games, I think, is such a great idea. Because then I think it brings so much joy when you see somebody else, playing a game that you created.
Right. And I almost forgot something, like in both of those activities, the 4 splats and the red splat, green splat, I had them make their own rule up. So I chose the activity, and of course they had to use the code to make the game work, but I gave them some choice. And so, for instance, with the 4 splats, they had to go to the corner and maybe do an activity like, or, you know, pat their head or jump on one foot. And then the same with the red splat, green splat. Each student, as we played their game, they did different things. Maybe they walked down the hall, maybe they ran down the hall. The top right corner, I think they were being Ninja Turtles coming down the hall, and those were their choices, and giving them that choice was so important. That exciting them more than anything was this was their game, and they got to choose what they were going to do. And so we had a lot of fun with that. Now, there are just a few tips I'd love to give you about using any kind of coding with SPED students, you know, modifying what you like. If you find curriculum or activities out there, I encourage you, as I know it's hard right now with social distancing measures, but students working with their peers or adults is so important, because some of them are going to need support. The 2 fellas in the bottom picture, I've worked with them for a number of, this will be the 4th year, and they have a lot of coding experience. So lots of times I would try to partner them with one of the other kids that didn't have as much experience. And then we also had teachers, the PE teacher, one of the paraprofessionals was a shadow to our Jalen up in the top corner. And so the adults in the room were learning coding too. And so we were all learning and having fun. Provide certain tasks for students based on their strengths and to foster inclusiveness. Again, that goes, like I was saying, Rayshawn down in the bottom corner, he is an excellent coder. And so he was always good for explaining some of the things. And when I would ask them questions about past lessons, he knew the answer, because he was really into coding. He was also really attached to his device. So that was another thing about Splats that's so appealing, is I can tear him away from his computer and interact with the Splats. And so getting him active was important. We fostered inclusiveness with the red light, green light. Even though Alex there in the bottom left-hand corner, he's in a wheelchair, we made sure he was able to run the code every time, or hold the splat that would turn red or green. And a couple of times he zoomed down the hall too. And so we just did our best to include every child in the activity. That top right corner, Jalen, he sat on the sidelines most of the time until Coach B got up and did red splat, green splat with him. And he just loved it. He laughed, and we had such a great time. Another tip is to scaffold with the visual step-by-step directions. I like to break it down in a Google Slides type presentation, or, you know, whatever you have it, you know, PowerPoint, you know, Keynote, whatever you use. But I like to have those step-by-step directions for the students, but also for me. So I make sure that I'm hitting everything and telling them giving them the right instructions so they don't get confused. And then also modeling in the platform is, you know, if you have that platform open in another tab, go in there and show kids how to do it. You know, the I do, we do, you do kind of model. And then this kind of sums up the whole thing. So I love the inquiry approach, but with special ed students, we can't just say, here's Splats, have at it. I like the structured piece of it so that they can still have some inquiry. They can still find out some things and still wonder about things, but you're there as a support. You're offering the supports, the structure of the activity, so that they don't have too much struggle. We want them to struggle a little bit, but not too much. And you know your kids and how much you can allow for them to be challenged, or how much they need to be resilient before they get discouraged.
I love that you mentioned too that one of your students, you have trouble, pulling him away from the computer, and other students, it's totally the opposite, where that, they're like, can I play yet? Can I play it? So, I think that's another great aspect of the scaffolding piece is it's sort of, there's multiple points of entry for different students who maybe have
Exactly.
different motivations. So, yeah, I love that approach. All right, so what coding games have you modified for your special education classes? And feel free, anybody who maybe has modified some coding in their special education classes, write us in the chat. Let us know what kinds of activities you're up to. But Ashley, for your classes, you've walked through a couple of examples here, but any other ones that you want to highlight before we move on to Q&A?
Let's see. I pretty much touched on everything. Like I said, that one of the more interesting ones was using the Cubeto with the middle school students, just because it is marketed for the kindergarten kids, and I did some some in-depth inquiry into Egypt, the geography and the history. But then and each stop on that little, if you remember, the Cubeto has the map, and each little symbol was a clue as to what they were going to learn about next. And so we had a really good time, and they had to answer certain questions before they could move on to the next thing. So that was a real fun one. And I think you could, any of these things you could modify. I think somebody was asking about the younger kids. I definitely think, you could certainly, with Splats, maybe like I said, the teacher create the code, or have older students create the code, and then have the younger students look at that and then use the manipulatives to create their own code. I think there's just a lot of possibilities if you really think outside the box.
Absolutely. We had someone write us in the chat that they have kids at home and they want to learn more about what their kids are doing at school, and I love that. The idea of a parent coding 101 night.
Oh, that would be fun. And actually, I didn't include this on the slides, but that was one of our outreaches at our primary school. We had community members, like board members, business leaders come in, and our primary school students taught them how to code. And it was such a fun event.
It's actually part of something that we're doing now too at Unruly, is the family engagement piece.
Yeah.
Some of our teachers are already doing it by having like a parent night where they come in and the students show their parents the game that they coded, and then the parents get to play it, or get to learn how to code it too. So yeah, any opportunity for family engagement is always great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. So we do have some time for Q&A. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us till the end. I would love to hear some of your questions, either for Ashley or myself or Marissa. We did have a couple people write in to ask some questions as well, so I can go through those too.
That'd be so fun, doing like a Splats talent show where all the parents come in and watch it.
Oh, that would be a lot of fun.
I love that idea.
We had one person write in and ask if you have any specific suggestions for students with autism, or if you would just recommend sort of the same tips that you had on the slide about modifying coding activities for your special education classes.
Yeah, we're a really small district, so in some districts they have whole classes with a teacher who specialized in autism, and I'm not really familiar with that per se, but I would just say use the same tips, and then your knowledge of your student, and go from there.
Awesome. Right, and then I think we went over this, but I'll recap it. Somebody asks, they have a self-contained classroom, so any tips that you have for special education self-contained classes?
Well, a number of these activities we did with the excuse me, I did with self-contained classes. my first year in this position. This is my 4th year. So, like 3 years ago, my cohort, Andrea and I, pushed into a middle school self-contained class once a week, once every 2 weeks. And there's a lot out there. Again, we started with that progression, just like I shared with you. So start simply so they can get the foundational skills and then build upon that. But I mean, everything that I shared was just proof that your special ed students can do this, and they can, with your support, of course, and get the other human resources. If you have an amazing tech coach or media specialist, call on them to help you plan and use their expertise to help you with the coding piece or the technology piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Using the resources at your human resources and, coding resources.
Right.
Awesome. So we did have one question about virtual, and I know Unruly Splats has a number of virtual activities that you can play. Ashley showed a couple of screenshots in her slides of, there's the physical splats, but there's also the virtual splats on the screen, which I can just go back and show you as well. But it is more challenging, in a virtual world. I think we've all sort of learned to accept that. But there are definitely options for virtual learning as well. I think one person in the chat mentioned a couple other coding platforms that also offered virtual learning opportunities. So, oopsies. See if I can open this. So you can see in the slide I'm about to pull up that there's sort of the coding screen, but then there's also the splats on the side of the screen, exactly like these, where you can actually see the physical reaction once the code is there, and it will actually light up, once you run the code. And so, it doesn't have the physical activity piece for all of the activities, but the students do get to see the reaction of what happens in the splat when you put the code there.
And you can see in that picture too, when we did the voting machine, the number actually changed as well. So even if you don't have the splats physically in front of them, like Lauren said, you can see how they're reacting to the code. So that's a great part of when they're testing. They can test their code before they're actually physically connected to the splats as well. So you test and you debug and you get it right before you connect and actually play the game.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I think we have a couple more questions too that we put in here after. Any advice that you'd give to a teacher who is brand new to using splats, or even just brand new to coding, forget about splats, but just coding in general? We had a couple people write in the chat that they're brand new. What advice would you give them?
Well, first of all, get in there and play, try things out. That's kind of what I did. If you have your own personal children at home, take things home and get them to figure it out and then tell you. And I did that with the Ozobots. I took the Ozobot home and said, here, I want y'all to figure this out and tell me how it works. But a lot of it was just me, especially with the splats. They have great support, and I was able early on to get on video conference calls with Emily, and she would share with me how things work. But a lot of it was just me getting in there and playing with it and figuring out myself too. And it's a skill we all can learn and have fun with.
Yeah, absolutely. Get in there and play. I love that. And we do have a splat sound effects on both the virtual and the physical splats. And you'll notice if you give any student 5 minutes with splat, and they will 100% of them will find the raspberry sound. So it's just a fun way to get students engaged and interacted too. All right, and last question, what's kind of been your favorite memory with splats in the classroom, or any favorite games that the students just absolutely love?
Let's see. I would have to say the red splat, green splat, and those. I think I forgot to put this picture in the slides, but I have one of them just all running down the hall, even Alex in the wheelchair, and they're all coming down the hall and they're just laughing and having so much fun. That was one of my favorites. And then another, when we were just talking, it was actually, I think, the first lesson that I did with them, and I hadn't worked with a couple of them in a while. And a student that was particularly quiet, I asked a question and I don't remember what it was, but it was to activate their prior coding knowledge because they had done it at the middle school in a past year's class that I'd worked with them, and he knew the answer. And so that was just so exciting that he could remember that and then take that and build upon that with the new coding lesson.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you for having me. I've had a blast.
Yes, and we've gotten a bunch of people in the chat writing that they learned a ton from this session. So I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing your expertise with us today. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to write us in the chat, or you can also email me, lauren@unruly-studios.com. I'll put it in the chat. And then Ashley, if you don't mind, if people want to reach out to you to ask questions, I'd be happy to pass those on to you. So I will share it to all panelists and attendees. Feel free to write me, and if you have any questions for Ashley, she put her email in the chat there too. Awesome. Thank you everybody so much for coming. I hope you have a wonderful Thursday evening, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.
Bye.